I really look forward to this event because it gives me the opportunity to reflect, to really think about where we've been and where we're going. It has become less about the immediate condition of the university and more about our continuing journey as a community. I've been talking to a lot of people lately about transformation, and by that I mean rethinking how we operate in a permanently changed environment. How do we let go of the idea that things might somehow be restored to the way they were 10 years ago? This summer, as I was reflecting on the past year, I also found myself thinking about all of those things Mary talked about. And I realized that in the midst of this challenging work we wrestle with, it's easy to lose sight of how far we have come. 10 years ago, being a public university in Colorado meant being owned and operated by the state. We were basically a state agency. We were organized, structured, funded, and regulated, much like any other state agency. Our budget process was focused almost entirely on one revenue source, state funding, while the accounting for things such as auxiliary enterprises, research grants and contracts, and donations happened in different silos. The state also held a tight rein on program approval. So when we thought about new programs, it was about competition within the artificially limited universe of public institutions and whether the state would give us permission to offer new programs. To understand enrollment numbers and trends, we depended on the talents of a single individual, the one person at UNC who knew how to correct and interpret the inexact data spit out by our conglomeration of computer systems. The composition of our student body, in terms of both demographics and financial need, was pretty much left to chance. If you met our academic standards, we admitted you, and we hoped you would show up. And we'd never even heard of discounting. We made almost no institutional investment in financial aid. When it came to things like capital projects, advertising, or technology, if you could come up with the money, you just did them. Although even at that point, we had started to think about these things from a university perspective. We had developed campus architectural standards and recognized the need for a centralized data system, and had just begun to realize that marketing isn't a dirty word. Because we were relatively generously funded, these operational restrictions didn't unduly interfere with our fulfillment of our mission. But by 2002, in the aftermath of September 11th and the collapse of the tech bubble, our world was fundamentally changing. When we eventually figured out that the changes were permanent, we also began to understand that they required us to think and act in entirely different ways. Today, when we talk about budget, it's from a university perspective. It's all UNC money, primarily from students, and we're committed to being transparent about how we spend it. Our thought process for developing academic programs is no longer distorted by the expectation that the state will protect us from competition with other entities, public or private. We've learned to be forward-looking, that we must think not only about developing programs to meet the future needs of students and the public, but also about how to compete with other institutions that are thinking about the very same things. We have developed a sophisticated, data-driven approach to actually managing enrollment. You still have to meet the same selective academic standards to enroll at UNC as you did 10 years ago, but we're thinking a lot harder about who we should be serving as a public university. We're investing more than $22 million in financial aid this year. And increasingly, when you look at our students, you see the diversity of Colorado. We have taken significant steps forward in the terms of our facilities and infrastructure. There are the things you see, like the gorgeous landscaping in our new residence halls, and there are the invisible things, like data security and conservation efforts. We've also learned to talk about UNC in a way that finally gets people's attention. Our Bringing Education to Life campaign is about celebrating who we are and articulating it in a way that helps us spread the word about what a unique and wonderful place UNC is. In spite of, or maybe because of, the turmoil around us, we are transforming how we operate. We as a university have come a long way in 10 years, and we should give ourselves credit for that. In July 2002, I wasn't at all certain that I would have the privilege of reflecting back on 10 years as your president. UNC is indeed a great teaching and learning community, and I am proud to be a student here. I'd like to share with you a list of 10 things, in no particular order, that I believe I've learned during these past 10 years. Perhaps the most important thing I have learned is that the human factor is essential. I came to UNC wearing my attorney hat. First, I was appointed to the Board of Trustees in 1995, which was a turbulent time here. Then, in 1998, I was hired to be the university's general counsel and board secretary. Inherent in the work of in-house counsel is the application of rules and laws to human behavior. And what the individual actually thinks or feels is not particularly relevant. What matters is the direction of the organization as a whole. By 2002, I had observed in both the business and the university setting that presidents don't necessarily get things done by issuing edicts. I thought change could be accomplished by the assiduous application of logic and reason. That first year was a bit of a nightmare. It was obvious to me what we should do to respond to the state budget cuts, but no one seemed to share my opinion. I thought it was a matter of no one understanding what I was saying. If I could just make my point clearly, then everyone would see the obvious. Further complicating matters was the expectation here that any leader would be guarded, manipulative, political, in the Machiavellian sense, and grounded in the power of position. I knew about this expectation, but I was disappointed that it was being applied to me. I learned that you don't overcome skepticism by telling people they're wrong to be skeptical. You have to, over time, earn trust by deeds, by your behavior, by the actions you take, by how you engage people in thinking and talking about where you want to go as an organization. And here is where the human factor is essential. This is not just an intellectual exercise. There's not one right answer. It's not a debate where you can score points and win. You can't change behavior and beliefs by force or by force of intellect. You cannot simply impose your will on people's spirits. You have to acknowledge and appreciate that you're working with human beings. You have to have real conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, about the things that matter most. It's not enough to show up at meetings and get your ticket punched, to say you met with all the governance groups. I realized that just because they didn't light torches and march on Carter Hall doesn't mean everybody's with you. You have to take time, Listen, pay attention to what people are saying and thinking and feeling and why. The second thing I've learned is that leadership is a shared responsibility. The hierarchy that worked so well for the 20th century industrial model neglects the human factor, and it misses out on the thinking of all of those people whose names don't appear on the organizational chart. I've discovered that you can't rely on the organizational chart as a roadmap for human interaction. The kind of leadership necessary for a university transcends the org chart. We need an organizational network as opposed to organizational hierarchy. We need an ecosystem of partnerships and collaborations, and the role of leaders is to foster those connections. This discovery of mine, it turned out, has been known in academia for quite some time as the tradition of shared governance. Shared governance is not only the path by which you get past skepticism, it's also a guardrail to keep you from going off the road full of your own righteousness. We know better than to believe in the hero leader here, but sometimes we forget that being a good leader requires both time and the help of others. We have a shared responsibility to fulfill our mission in the way that is most productive for students, in a way that provides transformative education and makes greatest use of our financial and human resources. I believe we are developing a UNC leadership culture consistent with what we value. By leadership culture, I mean shared expectations of leaders and traditions of leadership. Now we have to maximize the number of people who can and do take on leadership roles, whether or not they're on the organizational chart. The old model of leadership is about clear distribution of power. The new model is about taking advantage of collective wisdom. In the old model, strength was rigid, like steel. It implied mass and power, and it was linear. In the new model, strength is flexible, tensile, bending but not breaking, accommodating differences. The old model was about dictating direction. The new model is about vision, flexibility, creativity, and confidence without arrogance. Confidence that welcomes the contributions and talents of others. It requires not only expertise, but also perspective and judgment and courage. It recognizes good ideas, takes calculated risks, cultivates and liberates the creativity and ingenuity of others. Easier said than done. Which brings me to the third thing I've learned. Freedom to be creative requires freedom to fail. If UNC were a garden, we wouldn't be a formal place where structure is imposed in a way that constricts growth, where you weed out anything unplanned. We're more of an English cottage garden. We have edging to keep out the grass and enough structure to support the plants that need it, but we encourage the serendipity of things that pop up in unexpected places. Creativity is vital to the work of transformation, which is not about rejecting what exists just for the sake of newness or difference. It's about stepping away from our accustomed roles and positions to address the question of how we go forward unencumbered by the past. We need to honor what's valuable from the past, and we need to think through whether old habits and processes will serve us in a future that's constantly changing. We can no longer reliably predict what will happen in the future by looking solely at what has happened in the past. As a university, We exalt the individual freedom, individual responsibility, individual accomplishment. At the same time, we value our strength as a community. We need people throughout the organization to come together for the collaborative vetting of ideas through the lens of our mission, students, and interests of the university as a whole. We need just enough structure to avoid chaos and anarchy, but not so much that we unduly dampen creativity and quash innovation. This should be an environment where creativity flourishes and creative thinking gets translated into action. And this is a very messy process. Not every good idea will be a success, but we have to be willing to risk failure in order to allow great ideas to bear fruit. We have to be accountable, but that doesn't mean we have to be perfect. Experience truly is the best teacher. Real progress and innovation require the lessons of failure. I find all of this invigorating, but I have also learned, and this is my lesson number 4, what invigorates some people terrifies others. As I mentioned earlier, I came into this job believing you could reason your way through anything. I was relatively cavalier when I talked about risk because in the organizational sense, risk doesn't scare me. Now, personally, physically, I'm not a risk taker. Never have been. I don't like slides. I don't like roller coasters. I don't like elevators with glass sides. I don't even like standing at the top of stairs. I don't like the sense that I'm out of control. I have a genuine fear of gravity. For me, there's a big difference between the perils of gravity and the risks that you take in leading an organization, but I've realized that both are rooted in lack of trust and certainty. I fear falling because I don't trust my own strength and balance, but I have a lot of faith and trust in this place and in all of you. We will never all feel the same thing at the same time for the same reasons, nor would we want to. But I believe that by learning to work together and to trust each other, that we can face the prospect of significant change and see it as an opportunity. This brings me to my 5th lesson, which is that crisis doesn't produce lasting change. Crisis may provoke the thinking that initiates change, but genuine transformation takes time. We could have done dramatic things to demonstrate our poverty when the state made its latest budget cuts, but we've focused instead on how we will continue to fulfill our promise of transformative education delivered in a fiscally sustainable way. We're in this for the long haul, and that is where we're directing our energy. This is why I've resisted the traditional approach to strategic planning. I have seen my fair share of documents that call themselves strategic plans, which fall far short of deserving that label. I believe this is due to rushing to complete the task of planning, to produce a plan without adequate thought about the purpose of the organization, the purpose of the plan, and whether the organization and its leadership are prepared for or even capable of doing the work needed to move forward. Because plans are ultimately implemented by human beings, I don't believe ignoring the human factor actually speeds up the planning process. In our experience with Charting the Future, when we didn't successfully engage the university community, we ended up paying attention to all the wrong things. In many ways, we wasted our own time. Beginning in 2009, we redefined planning as an ongoing iterative process of taking control of our own future. We started this work by thinking about who we are, building on the concept of the exemplary teaching and learning community identified by the academic plan in 2007. Through a series of campus conversations, we articulated a vision to provide students with opportunities for transformative education by focusing on the intersection among academics, research, and community. To fulfill that vision, we are now developing and connecting multi-year plans that address 9 areas comprising UNC's core mission and 5 major university-wide support functions. You can find the details about our planning on the Higher Learning Commission self-study page of the UNC website. This work is truly transformative, and I'm optimistic about where it will take us. We will be prepared to deal with the 6th thing I have learned. The funding model for public higher education is irretrievably broken. This is not a choice to shortchange higher education, but states are under ever-increasing pressure to fund many competing needs. In Colorado, projected cost increases for K-12 education, Medicaid, and corrections may render the state unable to fund higher education at all within a few years. At the same time, the structure of our economy is fundamentally changing. Our economic health is increasingly dependent on educated citizens, and it's only going to get harder to participate in the economy without post-secondary education. In terms of the United States' international position, we have gone from being the most educated nation in the world to being 16th. Other nations have passed us by. The scale and the pace of the change around us requires us to think deeply about how we deliver on our mission as public funding disappears and higher education becomes more important than ever. We're getting a lot of advice from policymakers, pundits, and politicians about how we should respond to this permanent change. There are 2 things I've learned about this. A university should not be run just like a business, and bigger is not always better. As a university, we have the opportunity and the obligation to think about far weightier matters than does a business focused on the bottom line. Our focus is on people, both as individuals and as communities, and therefore on the future. The human factor, the shared responsibility for leadership, the necessary creativity and the opportunity to learn by failing, all the things I've been talking about, are the very things that set us apart from businesses. Of course we have to operate efficiently and effectively, but because we do so in service to something other than profit, management concepts from the business world don't automatically translate to the university setting. The idea that bigger is better is perhaps the most common industrial concept that gets misapplied to universities. Transforming lives through education has never been a volume-based enterprise. And with the recent changes in state funding, we are no longer even funded that way. Which brings me to my 9th lesson. Perspective matters. Because of our mission as a public university, we should always be searching the horizon to understand what policymakers and the public are thinking, but I've discovered that this is harder than it sounds. I find it all too easy to get dragged down by the immediacy of my daily work, especially if we're in the midst of something invigorating. But when we climb out of the day-to-day, we see not only what we've accomplished, but also what challenges and opportunities lie ahead. Only from an observation point can we truly see what it means to go into the future. And only by climbing back down into the day-to-day can we do something about it. It's perspective that allows us to take control of our own future. For example, we understand how the structural deficit in Colorado's budget will likely affect UNC's future state funding. We see the need for more students to earn meaningful degrees. And we know, as a university community, that we value our people. With this perspective, in spite of the turmoil, we have identified well over $6 million in sustainable cost savings, strategically built reserves, avoided layoffs, invested in salaries, learned a tremendous amount about creating a business model for a public university without a preponderance of public funding, articulated who we are in a way that resonates with people, and spent some very productive time on leadership matters so we are able to achieve the transformation required of us. We know what is required to fulfill the unique mission of the University of Northern Colorado. We can't escape the context around us, but we can decide to focus on what matters. This is where lesson number 10 comes in, and that is, you have to be honest with yourself. This means being honest with ourselves as an institution and as individuals. Because no matter how much perspective we get from others, ultimately we have to do what's right for UNC. There's a sweet spot between having an institutional inferiority complex and thinking everything is perfect. And that's where we want to live. Part of finding that sweet spot is defining what we value, what matters most to us, and how we're going to measure it. Last week, when my daughter Whitney came to visit, we were going through some things in the back bedroom and came across 3 massive scrapbooks that my mother had made about me. Looking at these, I was reminded that my whole childhood and adolescence was about doing the things I was told were important. It was all in there. Every report card, all the way through college. My ticket to get into take the SAT, not to mention the results, newspaper articles, programs from awards assemblies. The reality was, as long as something involved the memorization of facts or taking a test, I did well. But there was little challenge in it, and even then I felt the inadequacy of it all. I believe my real education began when I got to college. I got my comeuppance in astronomy class when I made a D on the first test, and I hadn't even realized I hadn't done well. But by the time I finished that first semester with 2 C's, a B, and a B+, I wasn't thrilled, but I was determined to figure it out. I'd hoped that college would be more about thinking than memorizing. And because I'd gone to a place like Wellesley, I no longer felt the pressure to be the best. I discovered what we talk about here as transformative education. And I gave myself permission to figure out the things that were going to matter in the long run. I went through a similar process when I became your president. There's a whole list of expected behaviors for presidents, the equivalent of kissing babies for politicians. You have to recognize what you're able to do, what you're willing to do, and what the needs of the institution are. Doing the best you can to be clear about who you are. That's not to say you shouldn't be open to considering things, but you have to understand the limits on your abilities and what comes naturally to you. Things that are charming and endearing from one president can come across as insincere or disingenuous from a president who's just not built that way. What we as a university community have to do isn't all that different. We must appraise ourselves honestly, figure out why we're here and what we're good at, set aside the unrealistic expectations of others, and decide how to move forward. Much like my first semester at college, my past 10 years at UNC have been a true education. An education in the positive, liberating, transformative sense. I am grateful to all of you for allowing me to be a part of this exemplary teaching and learning community. And I am more excited than ever about our potential to do great things together. Thank you.